Hi, my name is Isaac Feldberg, and I'm delighted to be here for a conversation for In Creative Company with filmmaker Peter Strickland about his latest Flux Gourmet. Peter, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks.
I'm really excited to talk about this film. I feel like there's so much to dive into with the subject of this latest film for you, but in starting to discuss Flux Gourmet, I first wanted to ask about the idea of sonic catering, just overall, because not having been familiar with it before watching your film, I was struck by how much it kind of resembles and mirrors so many interests that you've had in your films between the human body and digestion and sound design. There's so much packed into that I was especially delighted to find that you'd actually been involved in a band like this at one point. So I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, well, it started 1996. I had just done my first short film in New York, actually, and it cost the earth. This is back in the days of 16 mil. It was just unaffordable. So I felt quite burnt out. I couldn't do another one, but I wanted to keep active, and I wanted to kind of forming a band felt doable financially, but I didn't want to be in a band. I wanted to do something that I could pursue the interests I had in film. So we were treating sound the same way we were editing with sound. So I think when we cooked with food, we wouldn't perform. We would just document cooking. And then you take that sound. This is back in the days of 1/4-inch tape, and you treat the tape as the same way you treat raw food. You would chop it up, you would layer it, you would process it, you would mix it. So that was very much in this kind of parallel analogy with how you treat food, how you treat sound. We were going for quite a few years. It was never meant to be that long, but I think the impetus was people like Alan Spleck, his work of David Lynch, really just evoking atmospheres. That was a huge thing for me. It was not really, we dabbled in rhythm, but mostly it was mostly devoid of melody, mostly devoid of rhythm. I mean, at the beginning when we started, we were very much in awe of all these effects units. We'd never used them before, or I hadn't at least. So there's a temptation to drench everything in effects, delay and reverb and flanges and so on. And I think the more confident we got, the more we felt we could just let the sounds be what they are and not hide behind effects units. I think a lot of that came from listening to people like Alvin Lucia, Robert Ashley, Francisco Lopez, but especially Lucia, who's very much obsessed with natural acoustics and how those acoustics could deceive you, how they could play tricks on the mind. That was a big revelation for us.
And in making this film at this point, was kind of that the genesis of it, thinking about your time with this band, or did that come later for you after the idea of an institute?
No, I mean, Sonication was very much a starting point. It was almost like a joke. People were doing biopics of their bands, like Queen, Elton John. Weirdly, the Elton John one was edited by Chris Dickinson, who did Barbarian. It felt perverse to do a biopic about a band that nobody's heard of. I kind of like that idea. But I didn't want to sanitize it. I didn't want to deodorize ourselves. I wanted it to be, we're not pleasant people in the film. So that was quite important. But I think so. I think that was a starting point. But then what kind of came out of it was this whole idea of food as a poison for some people. Something that could be delicious for many of us can be a threat to other people. And looking at the stomach as this disruptive force, something you don't really see unless it's done as kind of a sort of frat boy type of comedy. Right. Which, I would not dismiss, but I wanted to look at it in a much more solemn manner. This idea of noise as, you know, it's an aesthetic, but also it's something which has a very personal focus for a lot of people. It can act as a kind of catharsis. And with this character Stones, it has a very literal purpose to hide his very embarrassing problems. So yeah, I think it was just an exercise. Well, more than that, I would say. I think it was something quite. There was a very deep frustration I felt with ignorance around stomach issues, and I wanted to see, is it possible to take something that inevitably people find funny and see, can you give it a different treatment somehow?
And with regard to that, I mean, Flux Gourmet has this satirical bent to it, but I really enjoyed the way that despite satirizing these performance artists and the institutions that are funding them, you're still writing this line, as you're saying, between sincerity and this this desire to really see people with kind of sympathy as well, the situations that they're coming from, as well as being able to poke fun at everyone. Did you struggle to find the same kind of humanity for all of the characters? Was there anyone who you had to kind of check your own opinions about someone who plays a certain role in that art institution relationship?
Well, I think the easiest target for me would be the financier, the patron. They're the ones we have a love-hate relationship with them. That's the nature of, you know, the people who fund us. But it would be too easy to kind of play the victim. You know, we're not victims. They enable us. We do have arguments. There's no, you can't deny that. Yeah, we can really irritate each other. But how to do that in a way which is more involving for an audience, which is not predictable, where it's you know, the financier being a bully. You know, I was not interested in that. I was interested in more in the artist being difficult and being Machiavellian, basically. So really, I just try to be quite neutral and not. I don't want the audience to work out which side I'm on. So yeah, I mean that was my stance, really, to not take sides.
There is that great line that Gwendolyn Christie's character has in the film, where she's talking about this divide between integrity and entitlement in the context of her wanting to have more say into the creative vision of what's being made. In kind of approaching that, I know that you brought your band back together to work on the film. Was that an interesting process? I know that you were in the band for a period of time, but there were periods where you were taking breaks, where you were breaking up, and that this was a chance to come back together. But did you struggle with bringing those two spheres of your artistry together in any way?
No, it was actually that side of it was very pleasant. It was just great to see them again. We you know, I mean, how do I say this? Circumstances, basically, that dictate so many of these things. So it felt very organic for us to do this. I wouldn't want to shoehorn sonic catering music in. You know, I have somehow used samples of our stuff elsewhere, but this naturally felt like the perfect film to call Colin and Tim and ask them if they want to spend a weekend together. And it was more than that. They helped a lot on set. It's their gear that you see in the film. Apart from the mixer, which is a prop, everything else was working. It's theirs, and we use those same machines. I would say they used them because they're the technicians. Or more than that, I would say. But they were there to help the actors, to know what button you press, how it's plugged in, all that kind of stuff.
And so you consider them more the technicians of the Sonic Catering band?
That was a mistake. I should have corrected myself. No, they're much more technicians. I mean, I say the technicians because I'm not a technician. That's why I say it. No,
of course.
No, it was very much a creative. You know, the three of us. I'm just technically useless. But no, it was always been a very natural process when we've done stuff together. No, it's definitely an exchange of ideas. Absolutely.
Oh, I was asking mostly in terms of, with this film specifically looking at a group of artists who are coming together and collaborating, who play different roles in their group. Did you see yourself as any of the characters more than others?
Well, I try not to, I see myself in all those characters, and not just the band. I see myself in Dr. Glock. There's an element of filmmakers being deceitful and devious. There is a side of me that does that, absolutely. Yeah. So I think a lot of these things it's a game of cat and mouse. It's a game of hide and seek. For an audience not to know which side I'm on, for an audience not to know which part is me, which part is not me. I mean, what I was more concerned with was the universal aspect of being in a band, and this idea of you have the core creatives, and usually you have people who some would use a pejorative to call them, session musicians. That age-old thing of, I think when they go their separate ways, who is going to succeed afterwards if they split up? The one who has the musical talent, as in the technical talent, or the one who has the ideas but can't play an instrument or even plug in a flanger.
Right.
I didn't want to necessarily answer that. I just wanted to kind of provoke those questions. Yeah. And I think these things come into, you see this all the time in court cases with bands over royalties and
sure,
the whole fairness of the system. So I think the relationships in bands are very, obviously this is maybe a bit of an inside baseball subject, but it's an endlessly fascinating thing. In the idea of control, creativity, and dependency. I think the whole idea of dependency is something very complex in bands.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a way as well, I mean, Flux Gourmet really does feed into previous films that you've made. And I noticed all of these references to past features of yours. I mean, even the Barbarian sound studio, the live cutting of mic'd up vegetables on the table, and the way that audio is also kind of laying out someone's fantasy in a way that in a fantasy specifically of being urinated on, or being used, being defecated on, in a way that reminded me of Duke of Burgundy. And of course, there are references to M Fabric far beyond Gwendolyn Christie being back for this new project. That for yourself, in having made these films that are all playing with genre in a very specific way, and they have their own tonal sensibilities, how did you approach the process of kind of acknowledging those, if that was conscious, while making Flux Gourmet? And did you see yourself as having more to say about those past projects?
I can see everything you're saying. I mean, that is the nature of just when you write and direct your own material, just stuff somehow, obsessions keep coming out. I wouldn't say it was a purposeful thing. I think there's always a danger to be, the in-joke, which I never like when directors do that, with a little wink. Right. I hope I can avoid that. No, I guess human beings have we all have a little range, and I guess I'm mining that each film, and I guess it's variations on interests, really.
Definitely. And kind of finding a new way to rearrange those ingredients.
Yeah, I mean, for me, but I mean, first and foremost was strip everything away, all those layers. It was a very human story for me about anxiety and bodily shame and very, very private problems, and seeing how can we tackle those with some kind of dignity. I mean, I guess I was interested in that, especially with regard to Taboo. Taboo for the sake of taboo was never interesting for me, but I think when it's connected to something human, whether it's desire, whether it's suffering, And if you're opening something up where someone can talk about it without feeling ashamed, that's where it gets quite interesting for me.
Absolutely. And I know that taboo is often seen when it's depicted on screen, that shock value as the film creating this safe space to kind of navigate a topic that would be off limits in other contexts. But with your films, there's such a kind of a sympathetic and kind of a loving approach to those subjects in a way that I feel like goes even further than that and questions the whole idea of taboo, why things are off limits and why we can't get comfortable with certain elements of being alive. Do you see that in this film?
Well, yeah, it's hard to put into words. I know with the Duke of Burgundy, what I tried to do there was, because I think so many films that deal with alternative sexualities within the film, it's alternative, and I thought, it's somehow, if you normalize it within the film, no one's coming out, no one is different from anyone. They're all into kink.
Right.
By doing that, by normalizing, I think it has quite an effect on an audience to kind of somehow open up a kind of acceptance. This one was different because Makis his character is the only one suffering from celiac disease. But again, what is similar to the Duke of Burgundy is that everyone's into Sonication. It doesn't solve his issues, but really, I think what I would try to do was just very methodically follow what he does and not, you hear one fart in the whole film. Otherwise, it's all done as voiceover. And my hope is that, I guess, initially, the nature of these things is people will laugh. But I think the more you're with him, hopefully, not everyone. I think someone said to me, "Oh, your fart jokes weren't funny," and it's like, well, yeah, congratulations. Who knows? Who knows?
Yeah. So, the discussion of flatulence is making me think about just sound design in your films overall, and just how pivotal the sound design often is in your films to, at least while watching them, I feel like it expands the parameters of the screen. I feel like there's more to the image that you need the sound to complement it, and you're really listening to the film as much as you're watching it. The images feel very enriched in that way through your sound design. When you're kind of finding the designs for your film sound, do you see it consciously as pushing the film in any way beyond something that's like narratively driven into more dreamlike territory, or is it goal oriented for you, or is it more seek and find?
I think it varies from scene to scene. And the more I do it, the less I prepare. I find the spontaneity of these things brings out surprises. I can think of two off the top of my head with Flux Gourmet. It's a very simple thing when Fatma's character is lying in bed smoking a cigarette. There's a tape machine playing. Initially, when I wrote it, I was thinking she'd just be playing some restaurant chatter or something like this. It was only quite late in the mix. I thought, she'd be playing back the performance. She'd be reviewing it, but more than reviewing it. I think she's reveling in the applause. So that kind of added something to her character that was not in the script. The spoken word performance with the domina talking about her daily ritual, that was not in the script. I think that came about from a frustration I had with that scene, that I just couldn't. Visually it was there, but the sound, we just couldn't get it right. We were just putting more and more and more noise, being very aggressive with it. It just the more noise we put, the more tame it became. And then I just thought, no, just strip everything back, make it as minimal as possible. Then I wrote this thing which was kind of inspired by bands like Throbbing Gristle, Nurse with Wound, Robert Ashley, even Butthole Surfers, White House, who would often source recordings of people on radio phone-ins or whatever, usually talking about quite disturbing stuff. I didn't want anything disturbing. I wanted something which was at least consensual. It's intense, but it is consensual. And then run it through a Nagra to give it this quality of coming off the radio. But that really changed the scene for me. It made it quite confrontational, which I really liked. I'm not sure that answers your question.
No, it does. It does. Thank you. It's so terrific to get that insight into your process in that way. So thank you for that. If I have time for, I think, one last question in this conversation, I wanted to ask you about the role of the influence of the Viennese Actionists on Flux Gourmet, which you mentioned in the press notes. And so I was doing a little bit of digging into that specific idea of fluxus that's associated with that movement, the idea of experimental art that's focused on artistic process rather than end product. For them, it was in many cases this resistance to commodification of art and to the idea of being in some way playing into the system. Was it a similar approach for you when you were thinking about them as influences, the idea of trying to make something that was a little bit more, that wasn't commodifiable, or was more niche? Or to you, how did that influence manifest while you were making this?
I think that was more of a general thing throughout. It wasn't necessarily with the Actionists. I mean, it's a very hard thing to pursue because I think just the nature of, I mean, you could argue, I think that the status that the Actionists have accrued over so many decades has, in a way, done the very thing they didn't want. It's kind of branded them, it's kind of commodified them. So I think you can't, your intentions are kind of by the by, really, in terms of how these things are appropriated and digested by an audience, especially as time goes by. So I think I was more focused on the confrontational aspect of that performance art, specifically with bodily fluids, abjection, I think it really connected with the story of someone who has to have a colonoscopy, someone has to offer a stool sample, something incredibly uncomfortable, really. And then someone just kind of, but what I really wanted to key into was the fact that Fatma's character hijacks this. She kind of piggybacks onto someone else's suffering. The guy who wants to make it invisible, and just lulls him into the spotlight. And the idea of, which we all face when we write things, the idea of privacy, and how that something so private, he says, sacrificed for the sake of art. Why the hell are we doing this kind of thing? What purpose does it serve? Does this elimination of privacy, does it allow others to somehow, is it a catharsis for other people to somehow open up about their issues? But going back to the Actionists, I mean, I should say I'm not a huge fan of the Actionists. I mean, I'm vegetarian, so I always had issues with, and I think also, especially, I think it's Otto Mühl. I think there were definitely some questions around his behavior and this idea of, like we see a lot with very charismatic leaders, the cult of a leader. I think that's a very dangerous thing. But aesthetically, I think Kren, Hermann Nietzsche. I mean, I heard Nietzsche. I heard him more than saw him the first time. That was in a Jonas Mekas diary film, not Walden, one of his other diary films.
Right.
He had some organ music, and he did a Q&A with the audience way back in the 90s in London. And I put my hand up and asked him, what music was that? And he said, it was Hermann Nietzsche. So at least I had good music. Yeah.
Despite all of the other question marks, you could still listen and get something out of it, or around that music, around that movement.
I think there was definitely a very strong element of catharsis to it, but I could get that from seeing Swans play live, or My Bloody Valentine. I think there was, and that's something very, very important for me. because I really got that feeling from those bands, and I look for that in film. I get that from a Gaspar Noé film.
Mm-hmm.
I get it from early David Lynch, and that's something which I just can't put into words, which I find really fascinating. And I think you're pursuing that. You're trying to somehow rationalize it in your head. In the pursuit of it, you know you're not really going to rationalize it. So, but I think there was this pursuit of that. So I think catharsis is a very key thing, and also the catharsis of the stomach and this idea of purging. It all kind of connects.
It kind of pursuing this same thread, that idea of the actionist activity of the process and the creation. It strikes me as well that kind of examining process and artistic creation in the way that you often do in your films could also be a way to kind of dissect narrative, like, making movies about making images and making sounds in this way. And I know that in past films that you've made, you've discussed specific genre contexts for some of that examination and some of that dissection, like Giallo and Eurosleaze for the Duke of Burgundy. For Flux Gourmet, was there anything kind of in specifically this, dissection that was kind of new or kind of untested for you, or was it all in that way kind of experimental by your standards?
Yes and no. I felt I was anchoring to a lot of things which were familiar to me. Such as band life. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those meetings are very connected to film life. Those meetings you have with financiers, charting someone's stomach issues. There's quite a straight narrative. It's quite a straightforward thing. So I actually don't see it as experimental. And the structure was very much copied from Pasolini's Salò. Okay. The circle of blood, the circle of shit, and so on. What I tried to do with the structure was link it to, well, you're basically traveling down the body. So you start, but you're linking that to a menu as well. So you have the starter being the tomato soup, but you're dealing with blood. Then you have the bile, which is the main course, which is the omelette. Then you have obviously the bao, the chocolate mousse. So those chemical components in those credits are linked to those bodily fluids, essentially.
Right.
But I did copy that to some degree from Pasolini. Yeah, again, I don't know if that answers your question. But
yeah. I was just going to say, we do have a couple more minutes left, and I'm realizing that I've been so eager to dive down these rabbit holes with you that I haven't asked about Fatma Mohammed, about your actress in this project, who has now been across all of the features that you've made. And I just feel like I need to ask about your actors a bit more specifically, because they give such rich and such interesting, unique performances to play these characters in your film, who are sometimes skirting the bizarre and skirting the uncanny at times. For specifically working with Fatma Mohammed, what draws you to her as a collaborator and has kept you finding ways to work together?
Well, I offered her a very small part in my first film, so it was never meant to be this long-lasting relationship. It was very much, she had one scene in my first film, and I don't know, but she had something. I think she had this intensity that I really focused on. So I invited her back for Barbarian, but then, I don't know, bit by bit, I discovered more. Each film, there was something new I discovered about her. And I felt she had such a range to her. And I always liked the idea of directors who come back with the same actors, John Waters in Divine, or Fassbinder and Margit Carstensen, or Hannah Shigula, Bergman with Liv Ullmann. So I loved to have that consistency. It was something, but yeah, I think she's incredible. And it's just odd. I mean, I spoke to her, when is it? Sunday. And she wanted me to help her get an agent. No one hires her for anything in Britain. And I think it's especially hard for her because In Romania, she doesn't always get much work because she's not Romanian. She's half Sudanese, half
Mhm.
Hungarian. So she's kind of like in no man's land wherever she goes. And we all know what it's like with accents. Actors are often told, "Oh, you can't play British because you don't sound British." But we're going to get an actor put on an Eastern European accent. That's fine. But yeah, so I'm okay. I'm not a charity. I work with her not out of sympathy, but I think she's just amazing. I think she's dynamite. I think she really brings out something in me that I can't do. I see her very much as a sister. Absolutely.
She has the same kind of intensity that your films match. It's a wavelength that I also I would struggle to describe if I was trying to write about it, but it is this both destabilizing and very forcefully anchoring presence that she has. I always feel slightly thrown off, but completely entranced watching her in your films.
Yeah, well, she's very funny as well. I mean, she's great fun to be around. But yeah, I think this one was very tough for all the actors. I mean, especially Fatma and Makis. The stuff they have to go through. So obviously there were a lot of conversations around this. And how is this going to happen? And how are we going to do it? And I think the fear she had of what are people going to think. I think her background is a bit conservative, and so so far she's very happy with how it's gone down. I mean, she called me after it was screened in Transylvania, so I think she was very happy with how it went and quite relieved. I think that is the word, because I think she was really worried about it. But yeah, I think it just. Yeah, I think there is a danger when you work with someone too much that it becomes a cliche or a brand,
right?
And a bit of a gimmick. So it's always that fear of, I feel I can't do the same thing again with her now. I feel I'm going to do something much more naturalistic, much more low key, perhaps. I think I've seen it with other directors; they fall into that trap. And as an audience member, you just say,
and you have to stay fresh.
It's tricky. It's tricky.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time for this conversation. This has been a delight for me, and I appreciate you sitting for it. Congratulations, and thank you for the film.
Thank you. No, thanks for helping with the film. So yeah, thanks for your time.
Of course. All right. This has been for In Creative Company. I'm Isaac Feldberg. This is Peter Strickland. Go see Flux Gourmet. All right.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
Peter.
Bye.